Okay, well, good morning to everyone. Again, I'm pinch hitting for Bill this morning. We want to, of course, remember to continue to be in prayer for him. And so I'm going to go back to where I was in the Gospel of Mark. We are toward the end of the 8th chapter. If you have a Bible, you can turn there. If not, just know that I'll continue to read the verses to you as we walk through this passage. We're going to look at about 4 stories this morning. We want to remember that Jesus has healed the deaf and mute man. He's also fed the 4,000, which is a different story than the feeding of the 5,000. And the really big difference between the 5 and the 4 is that the 4,000 takes place in Gentile country. That must have been extremely difficult for the disciples to go into Gentile country, to go into Tyre and Sidon. In a little bit, we will see that they go back to the northern part of Israel. Remember that as good Jewish boys, if I can use that phrase in an affectionate way, they'd been taught from the time they were 2 years old, you'd never trust a Gentile. You don't even talk to a Gentile. You never do business with a Gentile. Gentiles oppress. Gentiles will take advantage of you. Remember, the Pharisees taught that the only reason God even made Gentiles was to fuel the fires of hell. Now, Jesus, as we've seen throughout the gospel, teaches over and over and over again, you have not correctly understood God. One of the reasons Jesus came was to help us to more clearly, better understand God, what God is like. And so Jesus models that, lives that out for us. And so, again, I'm trying to get into the mind of these disciples, and this is beyond missionary work for them. They are, I hope this doesn't sound too extreme, but it's almost like they were going over to the dark side. And here's Jesus loving these people, taking care of these people, meeting their needs, setting aside all boundaries, racial and cultural and religious boundaries, as God does in relationship with all people. So we'll pick up the story now, verses 22 and 23. When they arrived at Bethsaida. Now, Bethsaida is on the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, but it's on the eastern side of the Jordan River, which puts it in Gentile country. That place where no Jewish person ever thought about even going, having any interaction. But Jesus takes the whole group over there. When they arrived at Bethsaida, some people brought a blind man to Jesus, and they begged him to touch the man and heal him. Jesus took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. Can you picture that? Here's Jesus, his disciples. They're in this large village. Maybe there's hundreds of people around. And Jesus is going to minister to this blind man. And the first thing he does, he takes him out of the village. So my first question to all of us this morning, why do you think Jesus did that? Why do you think he separated that blind man and took him away from the crowd? Thoughts?
Ricky, this is Dora.
Okay.
If Jesus was there to teach, it's hard to teach if you're constantly having to heal or being asked to heal. So by taking the blind man away from the village, he takes the the distraction of the healing from everybody's eyes, and he can come back possibly and talk as opposed to spending his time healing.
Okay, good. Thank you. Again, when I ask these questions, I don't have right or wrong answers. I want your thought and your input because it's always beneficial to me. Imagine for a second, you're blind. And someone tells you, hey, Jesus, that miracle worker's in town. Here, they grab you by the hand and they take you to Jesus. And then he says, follow me. We're going to go to the outside of town. Why? Put yourself in that position. Why do you think Jesus would do that for you?
I wonder if there might have been something as far as making the blind man show his faith a little bit in town with all his friends and all the people he knows, he feels comfortable. But when Jesus takes him outside, it's kind of like he's gonna have to step outside his comfort zone and put some trust in Jesus. That he's moving away from his known spot.
Okay, that's good thought. The step of faith for him.
Also makes it more of a personal encounter rather than being in the part of a big group.
Yes, that's a good thought. It makes it very personal. Here's a blind man. I'm sure he's constantly struggling to stay in touch, and that would have been very beneficial to him.
Ricky, I think it's significant that Jesus had just got through performing it for the public, feeding the 4,000, to where now it's no longer important that you impress people, because he was trying to impress people. This is just his pure mercy for this blind man.
Yes, they're very good. It does show the compassion of Jesus. Fred?
Could it be possible that he didn't want to do it in front of the authorities, which might rile them up for his safety at that time when he wasn't ready yet to finish his ministry? So he took him out, healed him, and then they left.
Good thought. Yeah, that's a very good thought.
But
Yeah.
Ricky, it's Vicky, could it,
Vicky.
I was thinking about when Jesus was over and he, with the legion of demons and, where the pigs went into the water, and the people after that made him leave because it scared them and they didn't know what was going on. And remember, Jesus went back over the Sea of Galilee. So I'm wondering, because he was in a Gentile country, if he might have been, I don't think Jesus was ever afraid, but the same thing, if he was in not Jewish territory, that if he did this, would it frighten people? So he wanted to do it just for that individual person.
That's a great thought. Yeah, that's definitely possible.
Ricky and Ralph off to the side here, and as I read, and I really appreciate the way you teach us. In verse 21, he's kind of frustrated with them, and they're just questioned again because do you still not understand? And he goes into 22 where they go to Bethsaida, but then it says he took the blind man, and so I'm wondering if he's still not just a little frustrated, like, look, I've been teaching all these things, you've been with me, and so now I'm gonna go out by myself. I don't want to have to explain to you guys in front of everybody, what I can't get you to understand already. Because I'm assuming the disciples stayed behind the crowd control to keep everybody from following them into the outside the village. It says he took them out. He took the blind man. I don't know, it's part of Jesus' humanness here, just like, man, let's just keep going.
Yeah. Ralph, that's a great thought. Anyone else? This is excellent.
I wonder if partly too, he didn't want to make a spectacle out of it and look like, they had kind of sham faith healers and that kind of thing even back then, and whether maybe he didn't want it to look like that.
That's a great thought. It was
Some
certainly,
magic or something, or-
yeah, show the compassion of Jesus. Anyone else? Well, these are great thoughts. Thank you. They're very beneficial to me. So Jesus takes this man out of the village, and then next he does something it's already done, but then he spits on the man's eyes. Now, I just wanted to remind us that in these days, people thought that saliva had curative powers, especially if it came from a pious person. Now, it doesn't mean that Jesus needed the saliva or the spittle to bring about a healing, but it means that once again, Jesus reaches people where they are at. And it reminds us that in our relationships, in our ministries, we have to always begin that relationship or that ministry by reaching people where they are at. So then he, spitting on the man's eyes, he lays his hands on him and asks him, "Can you see anything now?" Now, for me, this is a very important question. It's something, now that dog, Roger, Elaine, that dog is too cute. I am going to be severely distracted. I love dogs. So, and so Jesus lays his hands on the man, and you would think just by doing that, he's healed, right? He says, "Can you see anything now?" The reason this jumped out at me is this is the first time Jesus heals, delivers, performs a miracle, and follows it up with a question. Remember when he healed the man with the withered hand there in the synagogue? But Jesus didn't follow that up by saying, "Hey, let's shake hands and see if that hand works okay." When he delivered the man with all the demons we just heard about, legion, Jesus didn't say, "Hey, wait a minute, let's talk. I want to make sure. Did I get all those?" When he raised Jairus's daughter and brought her back to life, he didn't say, "Hey, someone check her pulse." Why would Jesus ask that question? Well, hold that thought. The man looked around and said in response to Jesus, "Yes," he said, "I see people, but I can't see them very clearly." Can you picture yourself at the optometrist? You're sitting in the chair. Have you ever heard something like this? One or two?
Yeah.
One. But why is the optometrist asking? The optometrist wants you to be able to see clearly. The optometrist doesn't say, "Hey, is this pretty close? I'm kind of in a hurry. I'm overbooked today." One or two, what do you think? No, the optometrist wants you to be able. And so what this man is saying is that I can't see well enough. Jesus, I want more. I need more from you. Then Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes again, and his eyes were open. His sight was completely restored, and he could see everything clearly. Now, I want to suggest there's a figurative example here that sometimes we settle for less than we could have in our relationship with Jesus. And when we do that, it keeps us from seeing everything clearly in a spiritual sense. On our journey of discipleship, we can say, "Well, one, I'm not going to go for two. It's okay. I know if I was more committed, I know if I was willing to deal with these issues in my life, I could see things more clearly, but it's okay." Here was a man who said, "Jesus, I need more from you. And I know that what I need can only be provided by you. So Jesus, help me to see more clearly." On our journey of discipleship, as we grow more and more in the likeness of Jesus, we have to always be saying that. Jesus, help me to see more clearly who I really am, what I need to stop, what I need to add. How can I help? How can I understand this person? How can I strengthen this relationship? Jesus, help me to see things more clearly. All right, now we're going to our second story this morning, and here is the famous, if you will, Peter's declaration that Jesus is the Messiah. So verse 27, remember now they have been in Bethsaida, that's the northern part of the Sea of Galilee. And it says, Jesus and his disciples left Galilee and went up to the village near Caesarea Philippi. Now, if you've ever been to this part of Israel, you know it's in the northern part. It's very close to the base of Mount Hermon, which is the highest elevation in Israel. Typically, there's always snow on the very top of Mount Hermon. So it's to the north, like Tyre and Sidon were, but it's more inland. Now, Caesarea Philippi was infamous, if you will, for the many different pagan temples that were there. According to which scholar or archaeologist you read, there was about 12 to 14 temples for a multitude of gods. So it was, if you will, this cosmopolitan place where people came from all over that region, sometimes from many miles, to worship their God. There was also this place close to Mount Hermon where there was a great fissure in it, and people would take rocks and drop them, and because they could never hear the rocks hit the bottom, they thought it led to hell. And some scholars suggest that's where the phrase the gates of hell come from. So here's Jesus taking his disciples to just the opposite of a spiritual place, if you will, as far as in relationship to God. It is again a cosmopolitan center for pagan worship. And as they're walking along in this environment, in this culture, suddenly he asks them a question, one of two questions. And now we're halfway through the Gospel of Mark. We're halfway through Jesus's time with his disciples, and he's about to spring two very important questions on them. So be thinking, why does he wait so long to ask these two important questions? As they were walking along, he asked them question number one: who do people say that I am? What's the word on the street, guys? What do you hear when you go to the marketplaces? As we're walking from village to village, and there's people walking behind us or passing us, what do you overhear them saying? Who do people say that I am? And verse 28, well, they replied, some say John the Baptist. Now, this is really kind of an odd response, because basically they're saying, the common people love John the Baptist and what happened to him, the way he was executed, beheaded, that cruel way that was just unjust. And God is a just and merciful God. So our God is going to bring John the Baptist back. And some people, and this would have to be people who didn't know Jesus before the death of John the Baptist, they think that's who you are. So it's very complimentary. And then some say Elijah. Now, we've talked about this, but just as and to remind you, the Jewish people believed that before Messiah came, Elijah, who was considered the greatest of all the prophets, would literally, bodily return to earth to prepare the way, in a similar sense that John the Baptist had done for Jesus. And to this day, when the Jews celebrate Passover, they have an empty chair at the table. It's called the Elijah chair. And during the celebration of Passover, there will always be one person in the family, or families, plural, who's designated to go to an outside door, open it, and see if Elijah has come to bring news that the Messiah is here. So this is a tremendous compliment for people to say, I think he's Elijah, not the Messiah, but this is Elijah who has come back. And so we are very close to the Messiah being in our midst. And others say, oh, and by the way, if we read this gospel account in Matthew, there is an additional person inserted, and that is the name of Jeremiah. And that's because Jeremiah lived in the time of the exile when the Babylonians conquered the Jews, took them back to Babylon, or at least about 95% of them. And it was believed that when Jeremiah saw the impending doom, that he took the Ark of the Covenant. Obviously, he had some people to help him. And tradition said he hid the Ark in a cave on Mount Nebo. Remember, Moses was buried on Mount Nebo. And the thought was that right before the Messiah returned, that Jeremiah would come back to earth. And then he would go get the Ark of the Covenant, and all the tradition and the conspiracies and the movies that go with that about the Ark, searching for the Ark and trying to find the Ark. But he would bring it back. And when the Ark came back, then the glory of God would return to Israel. Israel would be the most powerful nation on earth. All the other nations would come to serve Israel. So again, these are tremendous compliments, but nobody is saying he's the Messiah. So with those thoughts in mind, let's move on to verse 29. Then he asked him, but who do you say I am? Again, these guys, they've been with Jesus for probably about a couple of years now. We're halfway through the gospel story. And at least in my mind, as he asks this question, I can see most of them kind of look at the ground like, oh, Jesus, don't call on me. I'm not really sure. I kind of think, probably some of them are thinking, we just paid you some great compliments. Why are you pushing us on this? Who do you say I am? And then Peter, the most impulsive one, compulsive one, the leader of the group, says, you are the Messiah. His confession. Now, you would think that, okay, if Peter says that Jesus is the Messiah, then Peter's got this all figured out, right? So hold that thought, because things are going to go sideways here in just a moment. Verse 30 and 31, but Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. We've talked about this many times. Jesus is concerned about a nationalistic movement that's going to sweep him up, and it's going to, the Romans are going to step in. He's not going to be able to fulfill the redemptive plan for humanity. So he makes this comment over and over. Then Jesus began to tell them about the glorious, wonderful things that are coming for Messiah and those who believe in him. Oh, no, wait, let's see. I must have bought a cheap Bible, because it begins to say that the Son of Man must suffer many terrible things and be rejected by the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of religious law. See, I think all this time, those disciples were thinking, one of these days, all these religious people, they're going to come around. They're going to see Jesus like we see him. They're going to see him as Messiah. And now he's saying, now don't hold your breath on that. They're going to reject me. The Messiah must suffer many terrible things, be rejected by the religious authorities. He will, and then he will be killed. But 3 days later, he would rise from the dead. I think when he said suffer, rejection, be killed, they probably didn't even hear 3 days later he would rise from the dead. They're thinking, what? What kind of Messiah is that? Who are we following? What have we gotten ourselves into? I think it must have been utterly shocking for them to hear this. And as we get on through Mark, we'll see that Jesus has to tell them this time and time again. And as we get farther into our teaching today, we're going to see how Jesus reinforces this point of who he is, what he's called to do, and therefore what we are called to do and how we are called to live. Verses 32 and 33, as he talked about this openly with his disciples, Peter threw his hands in the air and says, "Thank you, Jesus, I believe." No, Peter takes him aside and began to reprimand him. Some translations say he rebuked him. See, in my mind, it's like the campaign manager, Peter, taking the candidate to the side, Jesus, and saying, look, this is not going to go over on social media. You're not even going to win the primary, much less the election. You got to stop saying things like this. And so then Jesus, very tenderly and with great compassion, I say that tongue in cheek, turned around, looked at his disciples to make sure everybody, including Peter, is going to hear this. And then he reprimands Peter. "Get away from me, Satan." Jesus calls Peter Satan. Oh my gosh, what is going on with that? You see, Peter believes Jesus is the Messiah, but his concept of the Messiah is wrong. Just as the Jews did not, and remember, all this applies to us. We can't just look at this like we're reading a history book. This is our book of faith, our book of discipleship. The Jews did not clearly understand God, neither do we. The Jews did not clearly understand Messiah. And I want to suggest that neither do we. In fact, I'm going to say that in my journey of faith, my journey of discipleship, time and time again, I've had to say, oh, now I see. Now I understand. I did not clearly see. I did not clearly understand. Is it any coincidence that prior to this, Jesus has just healed a man so he can clearly see? You see the spiritual reference there? In my journey of discipleship, it's just been story after story and chapter after chapter where I've had to say, I just didn't understand God clearly. For example, I was thinking about, if Bill's here this morning, he'd be talking about suffering and helping us understand about that. In my early 20s, I was convinced that if I did enough good things, if I read the Bible enough, if I prayed enough, if I taught Sunday school, if I went on mission trips, that if I had enough faith, nothing bad would ever happen to me. I would only prosper. I would only know good times. I'd never get sick. You know, I've had to change my mind about that. So I'm just curious, is there anybody else out there that would say, yep, on my journey of discipleship, I've had to change my mind about what God is really like and what God expects of me. Would anyone want to share?
You know, Ricky, it's Ralph, it seems like in a different lifetime, I agreed to have a Stephen minister because I was going through a divorce and I just knew it would save my marriage. And that's what God wanted me to do. He wanted me to have a Stephen minister that turned out to be Larry Gurley, closest friend. But it was going to save my marriage. You know, and 2 years later, when Larry and I had finished our time together, I had the courage to ask him, when did you know that my marriage wasn't gonna work, it wasn't gonna last? He goes, after our second visit.
Mhm.
This is 2 years of every Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock. And on the second visit, he knew, what he shared with me, he goes, I just knew you weren't in a place from what you shared, she wasn't in a place. Your marriage wasn't gonna work for lots of reasons. And so, of course, then he decided, you should become a single minister. I'm like, that's definitely not what God wants me to do. But I had to change my mind. And I had to say, I don't understand. I don't know where God's going. But I know I need to go there. And that's what I did. But I had to change my mind. Because it went into it thinking one thing and came out of it sitting here with y'all today. All these years later. That's for me.
Ralph, thank you for sharing that. Someone else?
Vicki, it's Cheryl, way back in the back. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
I was thinking throughout my life, I think I've come to really love the word discernment because it's not a word that you come by easy, and it's you have to open your mind, and things that I thought I conceived were possible or not possible, or if I just tried harder. And then discernment came in about God's healing power, and just when the blind man, when he took him out in private so that he could see more clearly, I think the worldly distraction sometimes gives us ideas about how things ought to be if we buy into them, or if we just work hard, or whatever. But then the personal journey of wisdom, of discernment, comes not quickly. The longer or the more depth you go into it, the more it increases your faith. I went around that some hard way, but I love the word discernment because it's such a deep word.
That is certainly part of discipleship. Someone else? Phillips?
I think when I was much younger, I had decided I had to figure everything out. I had to have answers, even for the unanswerable questions. And it was like the biggest jolt of freedom when I finally realized I don't have to have all the answers. I don't have to understand. I'm not God, and that's his job. My job is just to follow. That was very freeing for me, and it took a while to get there. But I want to go back to, I've just loved what you've said this morning, several phrases about the blind man and about seeing. Having worked with a number of people who were blind and deaf, and especially the deaf who get cochlear implants and for the first time they can hear. And we think, oh man, what a miracle. But you got to understand, this guy who was all of a sudden given his sight, he didn't know what he was looking at. I mean, he knew, I have a word for, I'm looking at a tree right out my window right now. I have a word for tree. And maybe he had felt a tree and he kind of understood the size of a tree, but never having seen one, he didn't know what he was looking at. So it took a while for him to get his language and what he was actually envisioning connected so that he had some understanding. And then I think what you said about, isn't this interesting that we get this story and then the very next story, we have this, Jesus has a conversation with Peter. Because I think that is the way it is with discipleship. When we say, Lord, I want to live my life your way, and we give ourselves to the Lord and we decide on a life of faith, then I think the seeing is a gradual thing because we have to connect our life experience, our language with God's way of looking at things and the new things that we're seeing in a new way and understanding, just like that blind man who was having to say, I've never seen red before. Oh, that's red. You know, we just have to look at life a new way, and that takes time. And thank goodness God is gracious and he's not pushy and he's patient with us, because for some of us it takes longer to understand his way of looking at things.
Yeah, that's a great.
Accept his way of looking at things, maybe not understand his way of looking at things, but to accept them.
Yes. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, let's finish this about back to verse 33. Jesus reprimands Peter. He says, "Get away from me, Satan." So why would Jesus call Peter Satan? Well, I think that unknowingly Peter was speaking for Satan. Remember, Satan was constantly trying to tempt Jesus. Remember the great stories of the wilderness. Remember when Satan took Jesus to a tall mountain, said, "I will offer you the kingdoms of the world. You can have dominion. I'll give it all to you," implying that it was Satan's, implying, as we go back to Genesis, that it all belonged to God. There was the fall of humanity. And Christ came to be, as Corinthians says, not the second Adam, but the last Adam, to redeem or bring everything back. But so it was like there in the wilderness, that was like a shortcut. It was almost like, I'll call it a satanic shortcut. So here again, Satan is tempting Jesus. Look, don't go the way of the cross. Go this other way. So it reminds us that how sometimes our friends, even with the best of intentions, can suggest things that are really not God's best for us. Verse 34, then calling the crowd. This is a very important point. It's one of those little things it's easy to skip over. So there's been a crowd there. As you begin reading this story, you think it was just Jesus and the disciples. And they're walking around looking at all these different pagan temples. But there's been a crowd following. Now, Jesus is about to call the crowd, calling the crowd to join his disciples. Jesus is about to give the crowd an invitation. He's about to give, so picture it this way. There is the disciples, that's one group, and there's the crowd, that's the second group. And Jesus is about to invite the crowd to join the disciples. He is issuing a call, an invitation, if you will, to discipleship. So keep that in mind. And he says, if any of you wants to be my follower, here's the stipulations. Here's what I ask of you. You must give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me. So Jesus is giving this invitation to people who've been on the perimeter. Kind of reminds me of my days back preaching, standing in the sanctuary, look out at the congregation and think to myself, well, I see some people who are kind of on the perimeter, and then I see disciples. That's what's going on here. Jesus has been reinforcing with his disciples who he is, make sure that they are that committed. They're different than just that crowd. And so he gives those expectations. And this is what he expects of them. Once again, you must give up your own way. if I can simplify it, you're going to have to make a decision to put God first in your life, in all areas of your life. You can't be a self-made person. You can't be independent. You can't say, I'm going to go on my own way until I have a problem, then throw up a foxhole prayer. You're going to have to decide there is a God. God created me. God loves me, wants to have a relationship with me. I'm going to enter into that relationship, and I'm going to begin to put God first in my life. And then I'm going to take up my cross. Whoa. So now when we read this, we think about Jesus being crucified on the cross, but taking up a cross then was the way, the most cruel form of punishment, a public execution. And for the Jewish person, it was considered a curse. We can go back to the Old Testament and see there's a couple places where that's mentioned. But to take up a cross means simply to choose to live like Jesus. Jesus came to live for others, to be obedient, even suffer and go to the cross and die. Part of the life of discipleship is dying to self, to our own ambitions and plans and goals and schemes, but to put God first. And then the third one is to follow me. Following Jesus means, it's very simple, I'm always going to let him lead. Jesus is not only my savior, but my role model. He's the good shepherd, my guide. And so Jesus then had been speaking to his disciples. He then turns around to the crowd and says, would you like to come join the small group? Would you like to move from the crowd to discipleship? One of the most difficult things of leading a church, if I can just use my own life, for example, is trying to get people to move from just being part of the congregation to being a disciple, making that commitment to discipleship. Now that I've been retired for, it's getting close to 3 years, I look back and I think, oh my gosh, I made so many mistakes. There's so many things I could have done differently. I don't know about you, but my hindsight is brilliant. It's just incredible how great my hindsight is. It's better than 2020. If I could do one thing differently, it would be to have a mandatory membership class. You see, I think I had it backwards. My thought was, if I can just get you into the church, if I can just get you to be, if I or somebody else can invite you, then you'll slowly move to discipleship and to a deeper commitment. If I had to do it over, I would have a mandatory discipleship class and say, look, these are the 3 or 4 main goals of our church. One of those is that you will make a commitment to community. A second one, you make a commitment to discipleship, and you can't join the church. Now, one of the reasons I never did this, because in the Methodist church, if you want to join, you simply confess faith in Jesus Christ and you're baptized, or we accept your baptism. But I think I should have pushed the envelope a little farther, because I think then membership in a church, at least, well, in any church, would have taken on more meaning. It would have been given more value. I think you would agree with me that there is a great concern that the Christian church in America is in a tailspin. It's not just diminishing, it's just falling off the chart. It's incredible how many people in America say, yes, I believe in God. How many of them also say, yes, I believe in Jesus. But the percent of those who regularly attend church or have some type of faith community is dismal. And I think one of the reasons for that is the Christian church, at least in America, has failed to present this holy call to duty, this great opportunity to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, yeah, it's going to cost you. You're going to have to deny yourself. You're going to have to sacrifice for others and serve others. But the glory that it's going to bring God and the change in you for the better, oh, that just, maybe it's just been watered down too much. And maybe that's just me, but just chew on that and think about that. So as we come to the end of what we want to talk about today, verses 35 and 37. So again, Jesus has turned to the crowd and he said, hey, how'd you like to move from just tagging along behind to being in the inner group? How'd you like to move from congregation to commitment? How'd you like to move from just being a crowd to being a disciple? And then he says to them, these are the things you're going to have to do. I want you to know what it's going to cost you. And then in verses 35 and 37, he begins to say, okay, now, if you choose not to, speaking in the words of Jesus, I feel obligated to tell you, this is what it's going to cost you. If you try to hang on to your life, you'll lose it. If you're going to hoard all the gifts, the gift of life, the skills, the abilities, the opportunities that God has given you, if you're going to hoard all that, keep it to yourself, if you're not going to rise to the expectations God has on your life, you're going to lose it. You're going to think you may have something in your little cluster of resources, but when you come to the end of your life, poof, it's going to be gone. You're not going to have anything. But if you give up your life for my sake and for the sake of the good news, you will save it. You save it in this life and the life to come. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Remember, in the New Testament, word soul and life are interchangeable. So you can lose your life. You can lose it in this life. You can be so selfish that nobody else wants to have anything to do with you. You can lose all your relationships, or you can lose it in an eternal sense. Is anything worth more than your soul? I think when Jesus spoke that, there was just this moment of silence. And then there must have been all the wheels, the processing of the mind and heart going on in the people in that crowd, thinking about the commitment they'd have to make versus what they could lose if they didn't make it. I think that goes on in the lives of a lot of people every day. And for those of us who've made that jump to discipleship, we have to remember that we have to always be reaching back to others and say, yeah, it's challenging. I've given up a lot, but it has changed my life for the better. And here's how: to whet their appetite, for lack of a better phrase, to make that sell pitch, if you will. Then verse 38, here Jesus gives the final statement to this invitation. He's saying, I'm giving you this invitation. This is what it's going to cost you, but it's going to be a greater cost if you don't make that commitment. And then he wraps it up by saying, here's the greatest cost of all. If anyone is ashamed of me and my message in these adulterous and sinful days, in other words, if you're saying, oh, I don't want to take the plunge, I don't want to go on the deep end, I don't want to be a disciple, Jesus is saying, okay, the day's going to come when I'm going to say, I was ashamed in you, ashamed of you. I'm disappointed in you that you did not make that decision for discipleship. The Son of Man will be ashamed of that person when he returns in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. It doesn't mean that Jesus is going to utterly reject them, send them to hell. He's going to, in essence, the day will come when he says, I'm disappointed. You had the opportunity, you had the skills and the ability, you understood the call, the invitation, the expectations, and yet you chose not to do it. So we're running out of time. I'm just going to leave you with this story. When I was a kid growing up, I just was always into trouble. Nothing big and bad. I think in retrospect, I was ADHD. I don't think it was a thing back then. It wasn't diagnosed. There was certainly no medication. I've got 2 grandsons that have been diagnosed. And as I watch their life, it's like watching my life again. And so because I had all this energy, I was just always in the trouble. I was just always going over the next fence, you know? I just was always in trouble. It seemed like mom was constantly having to discipline me. And back in those days, corporal punishment was practiced. I experienced that a lot. And I know my mom got so frustrated and worn out with me. And it just, nothing seemed to work. Dad would come home from work and he'd give me another spanking. And finally, one day, I think I was probably around 10, 11, 12 years old. Dad came home from work. I was in trouble again. And we just sat there. Dad was a very, very patient, thoughtful man. And he looked at me and I thought, okay, here it comes. I'm going to get a whipping. Then he said, Ricky, I am so disappointed in you. And I thought, oh no, don't say that. Beat me. Put me in a closet and don't feed me for 3 days. But Dad, don't say you're disappointed in me. And so I at least began from that point on, began to try harder, to do better, to avoid disappointing my parents and others. The day's going to come for all of us when we stand before Jesus. And the last thing we want to hear is, Ricky, so disappointed in you. Ralph?
Yeah. Thank you, Ricky. Let me stop the recording real quick.